Keanu Reeves walked into a dusty thrift store and froze. Behind the glass was a cheap, scratched-up watch he gave to the man who raised him, engraved with a promise they never kept. Why was it there? What happened to Frank Donovan? The answer would lead Keanu back to the road trip that never happened. Until now. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The sun hung low over Los Angeles, casting long shadows across Sunset Boulevard as Keanu Reeves stepped out of a black SUV, cap pulled low over his eyes. The meeting he was supposed to attend had been pushed an hour, and his assistant had gone to grab coffee. Keanu wandered, hands in his coat pockets, until a small, nondescript storefront caught his eye, a thrift shop squeezed between a tattoo parlor and an old bookstore. It wasn't planned. He didn't need anything, but something about the place, its quietness, its cluttered windows, felt like a pause in the noise. He stepped inside. A little bell rang overhead. The scent of aged paper, polished wood, and fabric softener greeted him. The shop was narrow and dim, its shelves packed tight with forgotten items and memories that had long outlived their owners. A rack of old jackets leaned under its own weight. Stacks of vinyl records stood like monuments to a slower time, and in the far left corner, just beneath a dusty 25% off today sign, was a locked glass case filled with pocket knives, cufflinks, and wristwatches. Keanu wasn't looking for anything in particular, but as he approached the display, his breath caught. There, nestled between two cracked leather bands, was a simple wristwatch. The band was fraying near the buckle, the face was scratched, but Keanu would have known it anywhere. It was silver-toned, round, and cheap by most standards. The second hand ticked faintly, slower than it once had, but still moving. His chest tightened. His hand hovered above the glass. He leaned in closer. The back of the watch case caught the light, revealing something etched into the metal. Faint, but still legible. "For the road trip we'll take someday." Keanu's throat closed. He hadn't seen that watch in decades. He hadn't even thought about it in years. But now, here it was, staring up at him from behind smudged glass, like it had been waiting for him to notice. The promise he made, the one he never kept. He tapped gently on the counter. From the back room, a woman emerged, older, with salt and pepper hair tied in a bun and glasses slipping down her nose. She wore a floral apron over a faded blue sweater and smiled warmly, unaware of the emotional hurricane forming behind Keanu's calm expression. "Something catch your eye?" she asked, stepping behind the counter. Keanu pointed to the watch. "That one, the silver one with the worn strap. Do you know anything about it?" She leaned forward, squinting. "That came in maybe a year ago. A man dropped off a box of old things, tools, books, shoes. That watch was just tucked inside. Didn't say much, just donated it and left." Keanu swallowed. "Do you remember what he looked like?" She shook her head, thoughtful. "Polite, gray hair, he had a slight limp, strong hands, like someone who worked with engines. Quiet type. Sorry, that's all I remember." Keanu nodded slowly, the pieces falling together. That was Frank. The limp, the strong hands, the quiet. Why would he give away that watch? He reached into his wallet, handed her cash for the watch without bargaining. As she unlocked the case and placed it gently into his hands, he stared at it as if it held time itself. The glass was cracked near the edge. The tick was faint but still alive. He turned it over again to see the engraving. "For the road trip we'll take someday." He was 17 when he gave it to Frank, right after they'd spent the summer fixing up an old motorcycle that never quite worked. They'd stood in the driveway one evening, grease on their fingers, Frank sipping from a soda bottle, Keanu shyly holding a small gift box wrapped in newspaper and tied with string. Frank had opened it, looked at the watch, and chuckled quietly. "Guess this means we're going somewhere." Keanu had nodded. "Someday. We'll drive across the country. Just us." Frank had smiled, slipped the watch on, and said, "Then I'll wear it until we do." And he had. For years. Even through Keanu's move to LA, the films, the premieres, every visit back home, Frank had that watch on. He never once mentioned the trip, never pressured, just wore the reminder on his wrist. Now, somehow, it had ended up behind glass, alone, forgotten. Keanu clutched the watch in his palm. It was warm from the shop lights, but it carried a chill that reached straight into his chest. He had to find out why. Keanu stepped out of the shop and into the fading light of late afternoon. The city buzzed around him. Cars moving in rhythmic congestion, people laughing outside cafes, a musician strumming near a lamppost. But for Keanu, everything was distant now, muted. The only sound loud enough to break through was the ticking of the old watch in his pocket. He climbed back into the SUV and sat for a moment before quietly telling his driver to skip the meeting. "Take me home," he said, voice low. As the car pulled away, Keanu looked out the window, memories flickering across his mind like passing headlights. Him and Frank under the hood of an old Buick. The way Frank would whistle tunelessly while tightening bolts. The quiet dinners they had when his mom worked late. The way Frank never said he was proud, but always showed it. That watch wasn't just a gift, it was a promise, one Keanu had made with every intention to keep, until life took him somewhere else. Somewhere faster, louder, brighter. Frank never chased him, never asked when the trip was happening. He just stayed in the background, showing up in all the ways that mattered. Now, the question that haunted Keanu wasn't just why the watch was in a thrift shop, but what that meant. Had Frank given up on him? Or worse, was he gone? That last thought gripped Keanu harder than he expected. He pulled the watch out again, stared at it in his hand, then slipped it onto his wrist. It didn't quite fit the same way anymore, the leather stiff and weathered. But the weight was familiar. Anchoring. He tapped a message to his assistant and canceled the rest of his evening. There was something more important he needed to do. The car rolled down Melrose and turned toward the hills. But Keanu wasn't thinking about scripts or set calls or rehearsals. His mind was in a Toronto garage, on a dusty map, in the hands of a man who had never asked for credit, but had earned every ounce of it. Keanu pressed the cool glass of the watch face to his forehead for a second, then whispered to no one in particular, "I'm sorry I waited this long." It wasn't just a watch he'd found. It was the beginning of something he needed to finish, or maybe, finally begin. The first time Keanu ever mentioned the road trip, he was 15, sitting cross-legged on the cold concrete floor of Frank Donovan's garage. It was early evening, and the sky outside was painted in shades of copper and blue. The radio was playing something old and crackling, blues maybe, and the air was thick with the scent of motor oil, dust, and the soft static of routine. Frank was half under the hood of a rusted-out Chevy station wagon, sleeves rolled up, hands slick with grease. Keanu, sipping a warm soda and brushing dirt from a fresh scrape on his knee, watched silently. He always liked being in the garage. It was quiet but never lonely. Frank didn't talk much, but when he did, it meant something. And in that space between turns of the wrench, Keanu spoke up. "Have you ever been out west?" he asked casually. Frank paused, glanced up, his forearm resting on the edge of the car. "A few times. Army sent me there. Arizona mostly. Some California. Hot as sin. Good roads, though." Keanu grinned. "We should go sometime, you and me." Frank gave a short chuckle, wiping his hands with a red rag. "A couple of guys in the open road, huh?" "Yeah," Keanu said, nodding. "No plan, just drive. Route 66, greasy diners, weird roadside attractions. All of it." Frank looked at him, eyes softening. "That sounds all right." They didn't talk about it again for a few weeks, but something had shifted in the air. Every Saturday after that, Keanu would bring it up again, half joking, half dreaming. "We could sleep in the car," he said once, "or grab cheap motels. You ever seen the Grand Canyon?" Frank said he had, a long time ago, before the war. "But I wouldn't mind seeing it again." That summer, the idea of the road trip turned into a ritual. Keanu would show Frank places on the map and circle the ones they wanted to see. They'd pick music for the drive. Frank liked Johnny Cash, Keanu leaned more rock and roll. There was no set plan, just a promise. One born not out of escape, but out of something sacred. Time spent together. And even at 15, Keanu knew what that meant. It was more than a vacation. It was a chance to say thank you in the only way that felt big enough. By the end of that summer, Keanu had saved up every dollar he could, helping a neighbor paint their fence, sweeping floors at a hardware store, even walking dogs in the neighborhood. He didn't tell Frank why he was working so hard, just that he had a project. One afternoon, he walked alone to a small watch shop tucked away off Bloor Street. The place was quiet and smelled like cedar and leather. A glass display sat near the back with rows of modest timepieces. One of them, with a silver case and black leather strap, caught his eye. It wasn't flashy, but it looked solid, reliable, like Frank. He bought it with everything he had. The clerk offered a free engraving. Keanu thought about it for a moment, then wrote it on the slip of paper without hesitation. "For the road trip we'll take someday." He wrapped the box in newspaper and tied it with fishing line. That evening, in the garage, he handed it to Frank without ceremony. Frank opened it slowly. His fingers paused at the edge of the box as he read the engraving. He didn't say anything for a few seconds, then took off his old digital watch and slid the new one on. "Looks like I've got no excuse now," he said with a quiet smile. Keanu grinned. "You better keep that on till we go." "I will." And he did. For years, every time Keanu came home, whether for holidays or quick visits between auditions, Frank still wore the watch. It was worn but intact, the strap softening with age. Sometimes Frank would give it a gentle tap and say, "Still ticking." Keanu would laugh, always meaning to bring up the trip, always planning to make time. But time, as it does, got away. His career took off. He moved to Los Angeles. His days became a blur of casting calls, script readings, hotel rooms, film sets, and interviews. The road trip, once so clear in his mind, started to fade into the background like a forgotten melody. Frank never brought it up again. He never asked, never hinted. He just kept wearing the watch, quietly, like a note pinned to the wall of his heart. And Keanu, somewhere deep down, knew it. Was still waiting, still there. Until now. Until that day in the thrift shop, when the promise stared him in the face again, worn, weathered, and undeniably alive. Sitting in his home later that evening, Keanu couldn't stop turning the watch over in his hands. The engraving was faded now, some letters had nearly worn smooth, but he could still feel them, still trace the memory of his own handwriting on that order slip from so long ago. He held the watch to his ear. Tick, tick, tick. It was still working, but something in him wasn't. All the years, all the moments he could have reached out, said, "Let's go," and didn't. He thought he'd have time, that they both would. He thought Frank would always be there, steady like a lighthouse just offshore, always waiting, never asking. He pulled out an old box from his closet and began digging. A few minutes later, he found it. An old photo of the two of them in the garage. Grease smudged on Keanu's shirt. Frank mid-laugh. Behind them was the old station wagon. On Frank's wrist, the silver watch gleamed faintly in the light. Keanu sat on the floor, with the photo in one hand and the watch in the other, and the weight of it all settled over him like a storm cloud ready to break. He whispered aloud, "I should have made the time." It wasn't regret for the trip alone. It was regret for every mile he let slip by, every road he took alone, every moment he could have picked up the phone, could have said, "Let's go now." But Frank never complained. He just waited. Keanu pressed the back of the watch to his forehead, eyes closed. He didn't know what had changed, why Frank had let it go, whether it had been grief, resignation, or just one quiet act of letting go. But he knew one thing clearly now. He wasn't going to let the promise die in a display case. It wasn't about a destination anymore. It was about redemption. He stood, took a breath, and grabbed his phone. The first number he dialed wasn't a publicist or assistant. It wasn't a studio executive or agent. It was a number written in ink on his heart. Familiar, steady, and more important than all the rest. It was time to find Frank Donovan. And this time, he wasn't going to wait. The next morning, Keanu boarded the earliest flight to Toronto. He sat near the window in first class, but his mind was elsewhere. Thousands of miles away, replaying memories from decades ago, like old film reels flickering against the walls of his thoughts. The watch stayed wrapped in a soft cloth in his pocket. Every few minutes, he touched it, just to make sure it was still there. He didn't call ahead, didn't send a message. There were some conversations you didn't plan. You just showed up and had them. By mid-afternoon, he stood at the familiar doorstep of a quiet apartment just west of downtown. It was the same building Patricia had lived in since Keanu left home, a place that smelled like chamomile tea, clean linen, and books that had outlived their first owners. He knocked. Patricia opened the door slowly. Her silver hair was tucked behind her ears, and she wore a navy cardigan buttoned neatly over a soft blouse. When she saw him, her smile appeared before any words. "Now, that's a face I haven't seen in a while," she said gently. Keanu stepped forward and wrapped her in a hug, longer than usual. She held on to him just as tight. "You okay?" she asked, stepping back, studying his face the way only a mother could. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I found something." They moved into the kitchen, where the window let in a square of sunlight across the small dining table. It was the same table Keanu had scribbled homework on as a boy, where Frank once showed him how to fix a toaster that sparked every time it was plugged in. The room hadn't changed. A little smaller maybe, but still familiar, still safe. Patricia put the kettle on the stove and turned down the volume of the soft radio humming in the background. Keanu pulled out the watch and laid it on the table between them. She didn't say anything at first, just stared. Her expression shifted, her lips parting slightly, eyes glossing over. "Is that?" Keanu nodded. "It's Frank's. I found it in a thrift shop, in LA. She reached out slowly, as if touching something fragile. Her fingers brushed the leather band, then traced the faint engraving on the back. Her eyes filled as she read it aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "For the road trip we'll take someday." She looked up. He never stopped wearing it. Patricia turned the watch over gently in her hands, like it was made of something more fragile than metal. Keanu watched her closely, searching her face for clues, waiting for the piece that would explain why something so personal had ended up behind a pane of dusty glass. "I don't understand," he said. "Why would he let it go?" Patricia sighed, then stood and walked over to a narrow cabinet. She opened a drawer and took out a small folded towel. Inside it were a few items: an old keychain, a photo of the three of them in front of a snow-covered car, and a pair of reading glasses. She sat back down and unfolded the towel beside the watch. "Hal gave me that box last fall," she said. "Said he was making space. He was quiet that day, quieter than usual." Keanu glanced at the photo. Frank was in the center, one hand on Patricia's shoulder, the other resting on Keanu's back. They all looked cold, but happy. "Hal didn't say much," she continued. "Just that he was going through his drawers, getting rid of things that didn't need to be held on to anymore. I asked him about the watch, and all he said was," she paused, voice trembling, "time moves on. And some hopes, you don't pack them for every road." Keanu stared at her. "So, he gave it up? Just like that?" "No, not just like that," she said. "He sat with it for a long time before he handed it to me. He didn't forget. He just stopped expecting." The words hit Keanu hard. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the moment pressing into his chest. "I kept it in my closet," Patricia said. "Meant to bring it up next time you visited. But then the holidays passed and you were filming and time..." It gets slippery when you're our age. Keanu's throat tightened. I should have called more. I should have come back. Patricia reached over and touched his arm. He never held that against you. But I made a promise, Keanu said. And he remembered. All this time, he remembered. I did, Patricia whispered. But he also knew you'd remember eventually. That's why he wore it so long. He wasn't holding it against you. He was holding onto hope. Keanu stared down at the table, the watch, the photograph, the towel with Frank's things, and nodded slowly. I think it's time I gave some of that hope back. Patricia nodded, her hand still resting lightly on his. Then go find him, Keanu. He won't say it, but I think he's been waiting for that. Keanu sat quietly for a moment, then leaned forward and placed the watch back in the center of the table, turning it so the engraving faced up. Do you know where he is? Patricia gave a soft smile. You're in luck. He's not far. He moved into a small house on the edge of town last year, near the lake. Still keeps that same old radio, still drinks instant coffee and fixes things for neighbors who don't even ask. He's the same Keanu, just older. Keanu stood up, pulled her into another hug and held her close. Thank you, Mom, for everything. You go tell that man he was never forgotten, she said, patting his back. A few hours later, as twilight fell across the horizon, Keanu stood outside a small, single-story home with peeling paint and a familiar old truck parked out front. He didn't ring the bell yet. He stood there, looking through the front window, heart pounding in his chest. Inside, through the glass, he saw a lamp casting soft yellow light on a worn recliner and a side table covered with tools and receipts. In the corner sat a record player. Silent for now, but he could almost hear the faint hum of blues music in his memory. He looked down at the watch in his hand, felt its weight once again. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a marker in time, a thread that hadn't broken, only stretched. He took a breath. He raised his hand and knocked. The door opened slowly. Frank stood there, older now, with more silver in his hair and a cane in one hand, but still solid. Still Frank. His eyes widened, confused at first, then softened. Well, he said, his voice like gravel worn smooth by time. Look what the wind blew in. Keanu didn't speak. He just stepped forward, reached out, and gently placed the watch back in Frank's hand. Frank looked down at it, then up at Keanu. I thought maybe... I didn't forget, Keanu said, his voice thick. I just got lost. Frank nodded slowly, closed his fingers around the watch, and stepped aside to let him in. The road trip wasn't over. It was just about to begin. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Frank's modest house, casting warm rays across the hardwood floor. Keanu was already awake, sitting at the small kitchen table with a cup of lukewarm coffee in his hand. The air was still, peaceful, but his heart felt heavier than the silence around them. Frank moved slowly in the kitchen, leaning slightly on his cane, humming an old tune under his breath. They didn't say much. They didn't have to. The quiet between them had always been a kind of language. After breakfast, Frank gave a nod toward the backyard. Garage still standing, he said with a half smile. It's mostly junk now, but if you feel like rummaging. Keanu stood, pulled on his jacket, and stepped outside. The crisp air smelled like pine and cold metal. He ran his hand over the garage's weathered door and pulled it open. It creaked on the hinges, just like he remembered. Inside, time had stood still. Tools lined the walls, some still hanging from nails that Frank had hammered decades ago. An old red toolbox sat beneath a workbench cluttered with half-finished repairs. Dust lay like a thin veil across every surface, but the layout hadn't changed. Keanu could almost see himself there, 15 again, wiping grease from his hands. Beside Frank. In the far corner, something caught his eye. A thick envelope, yellowed with age, peeking from beneath a stack of rags. He pulled it out carefully. Inside was a folded road map, the kind they used before phones replaced paper. As he unfolded it, a few dry creases split along the seams, and something else unfolded with it. Memories. Red ink curled across state lines, looping from Ontario down into the American Midwest, and then out toward the Pacific. It wasn't just any map. It was a plan, marked in the top right corner in faded handwriting. So Keanu stared at it, heart pounding. Frank hadn't forgotten the promise. He had been waiting, and he had been ready. Keanu gently smoothed the map across the workbench, being careful not to tear the fragile creases. He traced the route with his fingers, watching as the red lines curved through cities and countryside, over mountains and deserts, from tiny towns to iconic landmarks. Beside the Route 66 label, Frank had scribbled, "Old diners, hot coffee, no clocks." In the margins near Colorado, "Snow-capped silence, breathe it in." Next to a detour in Nebraska, "Long way home, worth it." Each note was like a whisper from the past, filled with the quiet humor and wisdom that made Frank who he was. Keanu had never seen this map before. He had no idea Frank had kept it, let alone filled it with such thought. This wasn't just a fantasy or a teenager's dream. Frank had believed in it. Even after years passed, even after silence grew longer and visits fewer, even after the world moved on, Keanu found himself blinking away tears as he came across a note written near a bend in the road through Utah. "For the day he remembers." That one stopped him. A single sentence, scribbled in the same strong, blocky handwriting, but so full of hope it nearly broke Keanu in two. Frank hadn't just planned this road trip as a possibility. He'd mapped it as a memory in waiting, a promise unkept, but never unloved. Keanu reached for a stool and sat down, the map still spread before him. The garage was quiet except for the ticking of an old wall clock and the faint sound of a bird outside. He stared at the lines, the words, the places that were supposed to be theirs. He imagined the two of them riding through the Mojave Desert in an old truck with the windows down and Johnny Cash on the radio. He pictured stopping for pancakes at a diner in Texas, Frank pretending not to like the syrup but finishing every bite. He saw them parked along a ridge in Montana, sipping coffee from a thermos, saying nothing, because the view said enough. And the part that hurt the most? He knew they could have done it. He had let it slip away. But not anymore. Keanu stood slowly and folded the map with great care, creasing it along the original lines, tucking it back into the envelope like a sacred artifact. He didn't need to guess what came next. He already knew. It was time to go. Not just for Frank, but for both of them. Keanu walked back toward the house with the envelope in his hand, heart pounding like he was stepping onto a stage for the very first time. Inside, Frank was sitting at the table, reading a newspaper, his glasses slipping down his nose. He looked up when Keanu entered and raised an eyebrow. "Found anything useful?" he asked, folding the paper with a casual flick of his wrist. Keanu didn't speak. He set the envelope down between them, then pulled out the map and spread it slowly across the table. The red ink, the loops, the notes, every detail lay open like a quiet confession. Frank stared at it. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he smiled. "You found the old thing," he said, voice softer than Keanu had expected. "Thought I lost that years ago." "You didn't lose it," Keanu replied. "You were waiting." Frank gave a gentle shrug. Maybe I just like dreaming about it. You get older, you stop packing bags and start packing memories." Keanu sat across from him. "Why didn't you ever bring it up again?" Frank looked out the window. "You had places to be. Big places. I didn't want to be one more thing you had to fit in." Keanu's jaw tightened. "You were never one more thing. You were the reason I even made it." Frank met his eyes, something unspoken passing between them like current through wire. "Well then, maybe it's not too late." Keanu nodded. "I'd like to go, if you still want to." Frank leaned back in his chair and gave a quiet laugh, full of disbelief and something else. Relief. I don't know if I'm up for hiking any canyons these days, but if we're talking sitting in a car and eating bad diner pie along the way, Keanu smiled. I've already cleared my schedule. Frank blinked. Really? For as long as it takes, Keanu said. You mapped this out for me. Now it's my turn to drive. Frank sat there a moment, then reached out and gently touched the edge of the map. I guess we better find that thermos. They both laughed. In that moment, nothing else mattered. No red carpets, no deadlines, no distance left unspoken. The road hadn't disappeared. It had just waited, like them, for the right time. And finally it had come. Keanu returned to Frank's house 2 days later, not just to visit, but to begin. The decision had been made in silence, without a press release or a calendar notification. There were no assistants involved, no studio meetings rescheduled with an excuse. Keanu had quietly cleared his schedule for as long as it would take. He wasn't sure if this would be a few days or a few weeks. He only knew one thing. He was done waiting. The sky was overcast that afternoon, the kind of quiet gray that felt like reflection. Keanu pulled into the driveway in a silver sedan he'd rented just that morning. It wasn't flashy, but it had wide doors, a low step, and soft suspension. Comfort over style. For once, that mattered more. He stepped out and looked toward the small house with the peeling white trim and the porch light still hanging crooked after all these years. He didn't make it to the door before it opened. Frank stood there, cane in one hand, the other resting on the doorframe. His hair was thinner now, but his eyes were sharp as ever. Took you long enough, Frank said with a small smirk. Keanu grinned and walked up the steps. Figured I'd get here before you gave the map away, too. Frank chuckled, stepping aside to let him in. Come on in then, world traveler. Inside, the home smelled like fresh coffee and old wood. The kitchen table was cleared, except for a bowl of cough drops and a half-finished crossword. Everything else looked exactly as Keanu remembered. The familiar curtains, the same chipped ceramic mug in the drying rack. The kind of home you could leave for years and return to without missing a beat. They sat at the table, Frank easing himself into the chair with a grunt and a sigh. Keanu set a small canvas duffel bag on the floor and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out the watch. Frank's eyes went to it immediately, but he didn't say anything, not at first. Keanu placed it gently on the table between them. Still works. Frank looked down at it, then back at Keanu. I figured you found it eventually. Didn't think you'd show up with it. I had to, Keanu said quietly. Because this, he tapped the table, the watch, the space between them, this was never supposed to be a memory. Frank's smile faded into something softer. Then maybe it's time we made it something else. Keanu sat forward, elbows on the table, his fingers lightly drumming against the folded map he'd brought with him. It rested beside the watch, as if the two items belonged to each other. In a way, they did. Two halves of a promise that had waited decades to be fulfilled. Frank reached out and unfolded the map slowly, smoothing its creases as though handling something fragile. He looked at the lines, the red ink, the little notes written in his own hand. Some faded, others still bold. His eyes paused at each mark like they were old friends. I used to pull this out every few months, Frank said softly. Never really told anyone, just like remembering what it could have been. Keanu's voice caught in his throat. Why didn't you ever ask me again? Frank shrugged. You were busy, important, and I was just a guy with a garage and too much time. You were never just a guy, Frank, Keanu said. You were the reason I made it through everything that came after. You showed up. Every time. Frank looked up from the map. Maybe, but I didn't want to be one more weight on your shoulders. Keanu shook his head. You were never a weight. You were the one thing that made the pressure bearable. Silence settled between them again, not uncomfortable, but thick with all the words they'd never said before. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the porch swing gently against the wooden railing. Frank finally leaned back in his chair. You know, it wasn't ever really about the trip. Keanu looked at him, confused. What do you mean? Frank motioned toward the watch. That wasn't about seeing places. It was about whether or not you'd remember. Keanu swallowed hard. I remembered, just too late. Frank smiled faintly. It's not too late. You're here now. There was a long pause. Then Keanu said it again, this time without hesitation. Let's go now. Let's pack up, get in the car, and just drive. Frank raised an eyebrow. You serious? Keanu nodded. Completely. Frank let out a low chuckle, almost a sigh. Better late than never. Keanu stood and grabbed the duffel. Then, we leave in the morning. Frank looked around the house, at the clock, the half-finished crossword, the view out the window, then back at Keanu. I never thought we'd actually do it, he murmured. Well, Keanu said, placing the map gently into the duffel, you planned it. Now I'm just catching up. That night, Keanu stayed in the spare room, just like he used to when he was home from college or passing through between filming locations. The bed was small but comfortable, the sheets crisp and faintly scented with lavender. He lay awake for a while, staring at the ceiling, replaying Frank's words in his mind. It wasn't about the trip. It was about you remembering. The next morning arrived quietly, with pale sunlight stretching across the hardwood floors. Keanu was up before Frank. He brewed a fresh pot of coffee and fried 2 eggs, just the way Frank liked them, over easy, with toast and strawberry jam. Frank appeared in the doorway, cane in hand, dressed in a flannel shirt and worn jeans. He looked at the table and grinned. Didn't know I raised a short-order cook. Keanu smiled. You raised more than that. They ate in silence, sipping coffee, glancing occasionally at the duffel bags resting by the door. When they finished, Keanu helped Frank to the car, making sure everything was secure. The map had been tucked safely into the glove compartment. The cassette tapes were on the dashboard, ready to roll. And the watch? Frank wore it again, the leather strap softer now, fitting just right. As they settled into the car, Keanu reached over and adjusted the rear-view mirror. Frank adjusted his seat and took a long look out the windshield. You know, he said, I always thought the first stop should be that little diner in Ohio. Place with the checkerboard floors. Keanu grinned. You're the navigator, I'm just the driver. Frank chuckled. Then let's get going before I fall asleep. Keanu turned the key. The engine hummed to life. As they pulled out of the driveway, Frank leaned his head against the seat and whispered, Didn't think I'd get a start this late in the game. Keanu looked over at him. It's not about when, it's about going. At all. They passed the old gas station, the streetlight at the corner, the rusted sign that used to advertise ice cream cones for 50 cents. Frank pointed at it and said, That place used to make the worst coffee. But the company was good. Keanu nodded. Still is. And just like that, 2 men, one quiet, one grateful, hit the open road, not to relive the past, but to finally live the journey they had always imagined. Together. The morning of their departure came with a sky so clear it looked washed, a gentle breeze rolling through the neighborhood trees, and sunlight catching the dew on the grass like it was waiting for something special. Keanu stood in the driveway, arms folded, eyes locked on a machine that belonged to another time. It was a 1965 Sky Noodle Chevy pickup truck, fully restored, chrome polished to a mirror, the kind of vehicle that didn't just take you places, but made the road feel holy. The bench seat inside was a deep caramel leather, and the old analog dash looked like it had been frozen in time, untouched by modern clutter. Frank stepped out onto the porch, still adjusting his jacket when he saw it. He stopped, mid-step. You've got to be kidding me, he murmured, eyes wide. Keanu smiled and gestured toward the truck. Told you we were doing this the right way? Frank slowly walked down the steps, one hand still on his cane, the other trailing along the smooth edge of the fender. Where'd you find her? Guy in Buffalo, restores vintage Chevys. Took 6 months and a few lucky breaks. Frank ran his hand across the hood like he was meeting an old friend. Again, 3-speed on the column, straight 6 engine, no backup camera, no nonsense. Just like you, Keanu said, handing him a pair of aviator sunglasses. I figured we'd honor the map properly. Before Frank could respond, Patricia emerged from the house, holding a brown paper bag with grease spots already showing through. "You'll need this more than you think," she said, smiling as she passed it to Keanu. Inside were sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, 2 apples, oatmeal cookies, and a pair of thermoses, one marked bitter and the other sweet. She hugged Frank tightly, then Keanu. "You boys be careful," she whispered. "We're just going for a drive, Ma," Keanu said. Frank added with a grin, "across the entire country." They climbed in and Keanu adjusted the mirrors as Frank settled into the passenger seat. When the engine rumbled to life, the moment felt almost cinematic. But it wasn't a scene. It was real. As they pulled away from the curb, Patricia waved from the porch. Inside the cab, the first cassette clicked into place. Johnny Cash. And so, with the map on the dash and the past in the rear view, they hit the road. One stop, one memory, 1 mile at a time. The road stretched wide and open ahead of them. 2 lanes of faded asphalt with fields on either side and the occasional rusted barn slipping past the window. The ride was smoother than Frank expected for a truck that old, but Keanu had thought of everything. New tires, padded suspension, even a few back support cushions tucked behind the bench seat. They didn't talk much at first. The truck did the talking. The hum of the engine, the rattle of the glove compartment, the soft hiss of the radio between songs. Every so often, Keanu would glance over, and Frank would be staring out the window with that half-mile of his, the kind that didn't need words to say everything. At the first gas station stop, just west of London, they pulled into a place that looked like it hadn't changed since 1978. A single pump, a hand-painted restroom sign on a metal door, and a soda machine with faded labels. Frank stepped out slowly, stretching his legs. He walked around the truck once, just to admire it again. Keanu came out of the station holding 2 sodas and a key attached to a massive wooden block labeled Men. Frank chuckled. "Now that takes me back." As they leaned on the hood sipping sodas, Keanu pulled out the folded map again. The next spot was circled with a red pen. Hamilton. Donut shop with world's worst coffee. "We really writing history today," Frank muttered. "We're not writing it," Keanu said. "We're finally catching up to it." In Hamilton, they found the donut shop. It was still there. The same cracked sign, the same plastic stools. Inside, the smell of sugar and fryer oil was exactly as Frank remembered. They split a bear claw and drank coffee that tasted like cardboard. But they laughed anyway. Each stop along the way was like brushing dust off old dreams. They visited a lakeside rest stop Frank had circled as Reflection Point, where they sat on a bench for an hour without saying anything, just breathing, watching the sun skim across the water. Later that evening, they pulled off into a small roadside motel near the border. Keanu helped Frank settle in, then returned to the truck and sat behind the wheel with the engine off, the map laid across his lap. Each place they visited added something to the trip, not just photos or stories. It added time. Time they didn't get before. Time they weren't wasting now. The next few days became a rhythm. Mornings filled with soft sunlight, evenings spent watching it fade behind trees and water towers, nights quiet but full. They followed the map like it was a treasure trail, hitting every red circled dot Frank had marked. Route 66, a drive-in movie theater that still played westerns on Fridays. An old general store where Frank had once stopped with Patricia in 1975. At one stop in Indiana, they visited a used bookstore where Frank had scribbled, "Place with that poem you liked." The store was still there, tucked between a barber shop and a bakery. Inside, Keanu wandered the poetry section and found a yellowing paperback. The bookmark was still inside. Frank's old receipt from a gas station dated the year Keanu graduated high school. "You kept this all these years?" Keanu asked. Frank shrugged. "Didn't mean to. Guess some things just stay where they're supposed to." They took photos at each place, not selfies, just shots of the truck parked beside old signs, of Frank standing under a painted water tower, of Keanu holding a cup of diner coffee with a grin that didn't need explanation. One afternoon in a quiet corner of Missouri, they pulled off the road and found a picnic table under a tree. The sandwiches Patricia had packed were long gone, but they still had a few cookies and a flask of coffee. As they sat, chewing in companionable silence, Frank looked out over the prairie and said, "You know what the best part of this is?" Keanu raised an eyebrow. "The cookies?" Frank smirked. It's not about finishing the trip. It's just about doing it." Keanu nodded. "It's not the miles, it's the moments." They sat there a while longer, letting the breeze pass through like it had permission. The horizon stretched wide in front of them, and though neither man said it out loud, they both felt the same thing. This wasn't about making up for lost time. It was about proving time hadn't been lost at all. Just stored, saved, waiting for the right moment to come alive. And now, with the road behind them and more still ahead, that moment was finally here. They crossed into Arizona beneath a sky so blue it looked painted, the kind that seemed to go on forever without apology. The sun blazed high and fierce above the desert highway, casting long shadows from saguaros and roadside signs that hadn't changed in 50 years. The road itself was nearly empty, winding between ridges and low hills, heat rising from the pavement in soft waves. Keanu drove with the windows cracked, letting warm air pass through the cabin of the truck. Frank sat quietly beside him, sunglasses resting low on his nose, hat tipped just enough to block the glare. He hadn't said much since they left the last stop in New Mexico. He didn't need to. Keanu had seen the circled spot on the map days ago. One word was scribbled next to it in red ink: diner. That was all Frank had written, but Keanu could feel its weight. Eventually, the truck rolled down a cracked road leading off the main route. A dust cloud rose behind them, soft and wide. Then, like something pulled from memory, the diner appeared. Tessa's Dinner. The sign was faded, the edges curled, but it stood. Keanu parked, turned off the engine, and looked over at Frank. "This it?" Frank nodded. "This is it." They got out of the truck, and the desert heat wrapped around them like a thick blanket. The gravel crunched underfoot as they made their way to the front door. Keanu helped Frank step carefully over the threshold. Inside, time had barely moved. Red vinyl booths lined the walls. A ceiling fan spun slow above them. A jukebox in the corner blinked its colorful lights, waiting patiently. Behind the counter, a woman in her 70s with silver hair glanced up. She smiled. "Take any seat you like, fellas." They slid into a booth near the window. Frank rested his hands on the table, looking around slowly. His voice, when it came, was soft. "My unit stopped here in 71. We'd just come back from the jungle. Dirty, tired, broke." Keanu leaned in, listening. "There were 5 of us. We didn't have enough money between us for coffee, let alone food. But the woman behind the counter, Tess, she just poured the coffee anyway. Told us it was on the house." He paused. "It reminded me people were still kind." Keanu looked around at the space, then back at Frank. "This the stop you've been carrying all these years?" Frank's voice cracked just slightly. "Yeah, this was the one I always wanted to return to." The waitress returned with 2 glasses of water and a coffee pot balanced expertly in one hand. She poured for both of them, her movements practiced and unhurried. "Y'all want menus, or you know what you're after?" Frank looked up. "Pancakes. And sausage if you've got it." She smiled warmly. "We've got both," Keanu said. "I'll have the same, and maybe a slice of whatever pie was made fresh today." "Cherry's good," she replied. "Crust is still warm." She gave them a nod and walked off, leaving them in that quiet bubble where the past and present seemed to sit side by side. Frank sipped his coffee, stared at the Formica table like it held pieces of his life etched into its surface. "You ever have a moment you didn't realize shaped you until decades later?" Keanu nodded slowly. "A few. This was one of mine," Frank said. "That night Tess poured coffee for each of us without saying a word about money. Then she brought out a plate of toast and said, 'You boys eat now. You look like ghosts.'" Keanu smiled. She sounds like someone who didn't need to know your story to care about it. Frank nodded. Exactly. We didn't talk about the war. We just sat there, drank hot coffee, ate toast and jam, and listened to Patsy Cline on the jukebox. That was the first time I felt human again, after everything we saw over there. The food arrived, and the smell brought something gentle into the space. Frank closed his eyes briefly as the plate was set down, like part of him had never really left that booth all those years ago. They ate slowly, with the kind of appreciation that doesn't come from hunger, but from knowing what it means to return to something once thought lost. The pancakes were fluffy, the sausage just crispy enough, and the cherry pie that followed was tart and sweet and perfect. When they finished, Keanu paid the bill and left a tip large enough to make the waitress pause. She glanced at Frank, who simply smiled at her and said, "Thank you, for more than just breakfast." She tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes, but said nothing. Back at the truck, Keanu helped Frank into the seat again. As he buckled in, Frank looked back at the building one more time. "I didn't come back for the food," he said. "I came back to feel like I mattered." Keanu rested a hand on his shoulder. "You always have. This just reminded you." They pulled away from the diner slowly, gravel crunching under the tires as the road reappeared ahead of them. The sky had shifted to a deeper blue, shadows stretching across the hills like long hands, trying to hold on to the past. Neither of them spoke for a while. The truck's engine filled the silence with a steady hum, the kind that sounded more like comfort than noise. Keanu kept his eyes on the road, but his mind wandered to that moment in the booth, the story Frank had never told. The way his voice softened when he mentioned kindness. After a few miles, Frank spoke again. "We lost Jonesy a few weeks later, got caught in an ambush, never made it home." Keanu glanced at him. "I'm sorry." Frank nodded. "Me too. But I think that stop at the diner, I think that was the last time he laughed. The last time he wasn't scared." Keanu didn't know what to say to that, so he reached over and turned up the volume on the cassette. An old Johnny Cash song played low, the melody heavy with dust and memory. Frank tapped the rhythm on the armrest, eyes distant. "You never forget those moments," he said. "You just tuck them away. You move forward, but they're always riding along in the back seat." Keanu smiled faintly. "I think some things are worth going back for." They stopped for gas an hour later. While Keanu pumped, Frank sat on a bench out front and looked up at the sign pointing east and west. 2 arrows, both sun-worn and chipped. He pulled out the folded map, now soft at the creases, and traced a path forward. When Keanu came back, Frank said, "There's one more place I want to see." Keanu sat beside him. "Lead the way." Frank smiled, eyes shining. "It's not on the map, it's in my head, but I think we'll know it when we get there." Keanu stood, helped Frank up, and walked him back to the truck. The road awaited them again, not for destination, but for continuation, for meaning stitched into miles, for memory that no longer had to sit in silence. As the truck pulled back onto the highway, Frank reached into his pocket and touched the watch on his wrist. Still ticking, still waiting, but finally moving forward. The terrain began to change the moment they crossed into Montana. The desert flatness gave way to gentle rises, then steeper inclines. Pine trees multiplied along the roadside like an old memory reassembling itself. The air turned crisp, the kind that filled your lungs with something more than oxygen, something closer to stillness. Keanu drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely on the gear shift. The Chevy's engine hummed under the weight of the climb, steady as ever. They passed small towns where time had slowed, cabins tucked beneath mountain shadows, and creeks that ran alongside the road like silver threads pointing the way forward. Frank said little, but his eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. The red ink on the map had grown faint with time, but the words were still legible. Big sky spot, must sit still. He had circled it with care, almost reverence, like it wasn't just a place, but a moment he hoped to one day earn. The road curved one final time and opened into a clearing. No signs, no crowds, just a slice of earth where the mountain dropped off and the world unfolded in every direction. Keanu parked the truck and turned off the engine. For a second, neither of them moved. The quiet wrapped around them like a soft coat, only the wind, the chirp of birds, and the creak of old branches swaying nearby. Frank eased the door open, and Keanu met him on the passenger side to help him out. Together, they stepped toward the edge of the overlook. Before them, the landscape stretched for miles, layer after layer of ridges, valleys, and snow-dusted peaks, each one fading into the next like brushstrokes on a living canvas. A river glinted far below, winding through the valley floor. Hawks rode thermals overhead. The air felt untouched, sacred. Keanu let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "Frank, this is unbelievable." Frank didn't answer. He just stood there, silent, his face turned to the wind. They walked back to the truck, and Keanu climbed onto the hood, patting the space next to him. Frank hesitated, then joined him. They sat side by side, boots resting on the bumper, looking out into the nothingness that somehow meant everything. After several long minutes, Frank whispered, "I used to think this view was the reward, but now I think it was just the mirror. What I really needed was to know I was seen." Keanu didn't say anything. Not yet, but he was holding something in his jacket pocket, waiting for the right moment to speak. Keanu reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small black box. He held it in his hands for a moment, almost like he was unsure whether to open it or let it speak for itself. Then, gently, he offered it to Frank. Frank took it with both hands, the way someone might hold a letter from a long-lost friend. He cracked open the lid, and inside was a wristwatch, simple, elegant, classic. The kind of timepiece built to last generations. The sunlight glinted off the brushed steel as Frank turned it in his hands. His fingers traced the engraving on the back. 3 words, no date, no initials, just this. "We made it." His eyes didn't well up immediately. They just locked on the words like he was memorizing them for good. "You didn't have to do this," Frank said after a long silence. "I didn't," Keanu replied, "but I needed to." Frank nodded, closing the box slowly. "You know, I never expected you to actually take that trip. I figured it was just a thing people say when they're young." "I thought I'd forgotten," Keanu admitted. "But I didn't, not really. I just buried it under everything else." Frank turned his head and looked out over the valley again. "The thing about time is, it doesn't ask your permission, it just moves. And if you're lucky, you get a few chances to move with it instead of chasing after it." Keanu looked at him. "This is one of those chances." Frank smiled faintly. "Feels like it." He pulled off his old watch, the same one Keanu had found in the thrift store, scratched and aged, and set it gently on the hood of the truck. Then he opened the box again and slid the new watch onto his wrist. It clicked into place, like it belonged there all along. For a while they just sat and listened to the wind, the ticking of the watch, the only sound between them. Keanu finally spoke. "You said earlier it wasn't about the trip, but for me, this was about coming back, to a promise I should have kept." "You did keep it," Frank said, eyes forward. "You just arrived on time, not on schedule." They both laughed quietly. Then Keanu leaned back on his hands and looked out over the valley one more time, his voice calm. "You built the road, I just finally got behind the wheel." They stayed at the overlook until the sun began to tilt low in the sky, throwing golden streaks across the valley. The shadows of the peaks stretched long over the river below, and the breeze carried the faint scent of pine and earth. Frank sat with his hands folded in his lap, thumb brushing gently over the new watch's edge. He didn't speak much after that. He didn't need to. His posture said everything, a quiet peace, a completion, a stillness not often granted to men who spent their lives doing for others and asking for nothing. Keanu slid off the hood and stood for a moment, hands in his jacket pockets, just watching Frank in the last light. He looked older than he had when they left Toronto, and yet somehow stronger too. Like laying down all those unspoken memories had made room for something else. Rest, maybe. Or grace. Frank eventually climbed down too, with Keanu's help, and they stood beside the truck, staring out at the mountains like two boys dreaming of what's next. But this time, they weren't making plans. They didn't need to. Back in the cab, Keanu unfolded the map one final time. The circles were all there. Arizona, Route 66, the diner, and now this place. The viewpoint under the biggest sky either of them had ever seen. The creases in the paper had worn thin, edges curling like old photographs. He folded it again and tucked it into the glove compartment. Frank adjusted the new watch on his wrist, then tapped the dashboard twice. "She made it too," he said of the truck. Keanu grinned. "She carried us every mile." As they pulled away from the overlook, the road ahead glowed in that rare kind of evening light. Soft, forgiving, like the world was offering them a second chance, with no expiration date. Frank reached over and turned the radio knob. The cassette rolled, Patsy Cline this time. A song about longing, but also about home. They didn't say where they were heading next. They didn't have to. They were already exactly where they needed to be. And as the truck followed the curve of the road, with the mountains behind them and the horizon still wide open, Frank leaned his head against the window, eyes closed, lips curved into a smile. The trip wasn't over, but the waiting was. The sky had shifted into deep amber when the first sputter came from the engine. Keanu's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. A second later, the truck gave a low groan, then coughed. One short, rattling jolt that made the entire cab tremble. The gas pedal lost its response. He guided the Chevy carefully onto the gravel shoulder, trying not to overreact, but already knowing. Frank looked over. "What do you think?" Keanu shut off the ignition and listened. The silence that followed was louder than the engine had ever been. "Feels like a stall," he said. "Maybe fuel line. Could be the starter, though." Frank chuckled. "Well, if it's the starter, it waited a long time to speak up." They both stepped out. The air was cooler now, shadows stretching long across the highway. They were miles from any gas station, and the closest motel they'd seen was back in a blink-and-miss-it town an hour behind them. The road ahead was quiet, just the hum of distant insects and the wind whispering through tall grass. Keanu popped the hood, and Frank stood beside him, both of them peering into the engine like two men revisiting the past. "Wench kit still in the glove box?" Frank asked. Keanu nodded, already reaching for it. "Wrapped in the red towel. You remember that?" Keanu grinned. "You said if I forgot, I didn't deserve to drive." He pulled out the tools and unrolled the faded towel across the front fender. The sockets and ratchets clinked softly against the metal. They weren't fancy, but they had history. They were the same tools Frank had given Keanu when he turned 16. Keanu got to work, checking the battery leads, testing the relay, reaching into tight spaces with hands that hadn't forgotten what it meant to trust feel over sight. Frank leaned against the side of the truck, watching him with quiet satisfaction. "You were always paying more attention than you let on. I just didn't want to mess up your flow." Frank smiled. "You've got your own now." The fix didn't come quickly. After a few tries, they realized it wasn't something that could be solved roadside. Maybe a coil, maybe deeper. Keanu sat down on the front bumper, wiping sweat and grease from his palms. Frank sat next to him with effort, then let out a low laugh. "Well," he said, "this just became a proper adventure." Keanu looked up at the stars beginning to peek through. "Guess the road wanted to remind us who's boss." They ended up walking a mile down the road until they spotted a dim, flickering sign for a roadside inn. It looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. Paint chipping, a dusty vending machine outside, and a single fluorescent light buzzing above the office door. The man behind the desk barely looked up when Keanu asked for a room. He slid a key across the counter and muttered, "Room 3, heater's tricky." You're lucky we had anything open." Frank chuckled once they were back outside. Cozy? The room was small, with 2 creaky beds, a humming mini fridge, and a faded curtain that barely closed. But it was warm, and at that moment, that was enough. Keanu sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his hands together, still thinking about the engine. "I should have checked the belts earlier. I noticed a little lag 2 stops ago." Frank waved it off. "Don't go turning this into guilt. You caught it. That's more than most would." Keanu looked over. "Still wanted to fix it?" Frank leaned back on his pillow, hands behind his head. "You did fix it, just not with tools." Keanu furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" Frank looked at him with that calm steadiness he always had. "You pulled over. You worked through it. You remembered where the wrench kit was. You used your head, your hands. You tried. That's all fixing really is. Showing up when something's broken." Keanu leaned back in his chair and exhaled. "I learned that from you." There was a pause, not awkward, just thoughtful. "You know," Frank said, "when I was your age, I thought I had to be perfect to be helpful. If I couldn't fix something all the way, I'd get frustrated, thought it meant I didn't know enough. And now?" Frank shrugged. "Now I know it's not about fixing everything. It's about being willing to keep the hood open long enough to learn." Keanu laughed softly. "That's a pretty decent metaphor." Frank smiled. "Life gave me a few." The heater in the room kicked in with a loud clang, rattling the old pipes like they were waking from a long nap. Frank stared at the ceiling for a moment. "This is one of the best breakdowns I've ever had," he said. Keanu glanced over. "Yeah?" Frank turned to him, eyes bright. "Because I got to watch my kid figure it out." Keanu didn't say anything. He just nodded, and the silence said the rest. The next morning, Keanu woke early to the sound of birds and a soft breeze coming through the cracked motel window. Frank was already up, sitting outside on the little concrete step with a cup of coffee in one hand and a worn newspaper in the other. Keanu joined him, rubbing his eyes and stretching as he took a seat beside him. "You sleep all right?" Frank asked without looking up. "Better than I expected," Keanu replied. "These places always surprise me." Frank folded the paper on his lap. "Guess we're both a little easier to please these days." They finished their coffee in silence, then walked back to the truck as the morning sun began warming the pavement. Keanu popped the hood again, more confident now. He double-checked the battery, cleaned the connections with an old brush, then leaned under the frame and tapped the starter with the flat side of a wrench. When he climbed back into the cab and turned the key, the engine groaned, then turned over once, then again, and finally it roared to life. Frank clapped once. "Now that's the sound I remember." Keanu grinned, brushing his hands together. "Didn't think it'd be that simple." Frank nodded toward the open hood. "It never is. But simple fixes don't mean small lessons." They closed up the truck and packed their things. Before they pulled out of the lot, Keanu looked back at the motel. Its cracked siding, its flickering vacancy sign, and the little potted cactus by the office door. "I'm going to remember this place," he said. Frank nodded. Not for what broke, but for what worked. As they eased back onto the road, Keanu noticed something in the glove box had shifted. He reached over and found one of the old maps, the red ink smeared from the heat in folds. But he also found something else. A handwritten note Frank must have left years ago, folded neatly, yellowing at the edges. He opened it and read quietly. "To the boy who always asked why. When the engine stalls, don't panic. Sometimes a pause is just a reminder that you're still learning, and that you've got more than one gear." Keanu didn't say anything. He folded the note, tucked it back in, and smiled. As the highway stretched out in front of them once more, he realized something simple but profound. The breakdown hadn't delayed them. It had brought them exactly where they needed to be. Later that afternoon, with the truck running again but still needing a proper inspection, Keanu and Frank rolled slowly into a small town tucked into the folds of the Montana landscape. It had only one main street, a post office, and a single auto shop with a wooden sign above the garage. Marty's Garage, St. 1964. The paint was faded, and one of the windows had a crack held together by clear tape, but the building stood like it had no intention of going anywhere. Keanu parked the Chevy just outside the front office, and the moment the engine clicked off, Frank let out a soft grunt, rubbing his knee as he reached for the handle. "This place smells like oil and wisdom," he muttered, stepping out. Inside, the shop was cool and dark, lit by a single flickering bulb and the hazy light filtering through dusty blinds. Calendars from different years, tool advertisements, and old racing posters hung on the walls like wallpaper. At the front counter sat an older man with rolled sleeves, gray in his beard, and oil-stained hands. He glanced up with curiosity when the bell jingled. "Afternoon," the man said, setting down a wrench. "You two just roll in from the highway?" Keanu nodded. "Broke down last night. Got it started again this morning, but we want a second look. Might be the starter, or something electrical." The man stood, brushing his hands on a rag. "Well, let's see what we're working with." But as Frank stepped forward into the light, the man froze mid-step. His face changed. "Wait, no way," he said, narrowing his eyes. "Frank Donovan?" Frank raised his brow. "Well, I'll be. Marty?" A beat passed. Then a deep chuckle burst out of the man's chest as he came around the counter and wrapped Frank in a bear hug that looked years overdue. "You're still alive," Marty said, laughing and shaking his head. "I thought you moved off to some beach somewhere and forgot the rest of us." "More like a dusty garage and a cane," Frank replied. Marty turned to Keanu, who stood watching curiously. "And this?" Frank smiled. "My son." Marty's eyes widened. "No kidding. You're Donovan's kid." Keanu extended a hand. "Keanu." Marty gripped it. "You don't even know the half of what your dad's done. Come on, I'll show you." He led them toward the back of the garage. "This place? Wouldn't be here without him. Man showed up at the worst moment of my life and handed me a second chance." Marty pushed open a side door into the rear of the shop where the air was thick with the scent of oil and metal. Workbenches lined the walls, cluttered with sockets, ratchets, and coffee mugs turned into screw holders. A few younger mechanics paused what they were doing to glance over. One of them whispered, "Is that who I think it is?" But Marty waved them back to their work. He pointed to an old photograph nailed above the tool board. Two young men covered in grease, smiling beside a half-built muscle car. One of them was clearly Marty, though his hair was darker and thicker then. The other was unmistakably Frank, sleeves rolled, a rag over his shoulder, grin wide and effortless. "That's the day we got the shop running again," Marty said. "Lost everything in a fire. My insurance claim was stuck. My hands were too burned to hold a wrench, and then this guy shows up, no fanfare, no questions, and starts fixing what's left." Keanu stepped closer, looking at the image with new eyes. "I never heard this story," he said. Frank shrugged. "Didn't think it needed repeating." "It needed remembering," Marty replied. "The man brought back my livelihood. I couldn't pay him. He wouldn't take a dime, just said, 'When you can, help the next guy.'" Marty's voice cracked slightly as he stepped away from the photo. "You saved me, Frank. I was ready to quit, maybe even leave town. You didn't just patch wires. You restored something in me I didn't even know was broken." Frank stood quiet, the weight of the words settling into his chest. Keanu looked over, his face softening. "You never mentioned any of this." Frank shrugged again. "I didn't do it to be remembered." Marty turned back to him. "That's exactly why we remember you." He reached for a drawer and pulled out a dusty old plaque. "I kept this all these years. Never hung it up. Felt like it wasn't mine alone." The plaque read, "To the hands that helped rebuild, not just engines, but men." "I want you to take it," Marty said, offering it to Frank. Frank shook his head. "You earned it, Marty. You built this place." Marty smiled. "Maybe, but you lit the first spark." Keanu watched the exchange, something swelling in his chest. Pride, yes, but also something more humbling. He'd always known Frank was steady. He hadn't known he was legendary. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm golden hue through the garage windows, Marty offered the two of them a couple of chairs. They sat in a quiet corner, surrounded by half-finished projects and the faint hum of distant tools. "So, what brings you through this way?" Marty asked. Keanu smiled. "Just a long overdue road trip." "Long overdue?" Marty echoed. Frank leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "He owed me one." Marty grinned. "Well, looks like he's paying up in full." They spent the next hour swapping stories, some about cars, some about people. Marty recounted a few names Frank had helped years ago, folks from neighboring towns who'd had nothing left when their tools were stolen or their shops shut down. Frank had quietly shown up, helped rebuild, taught someone's kid how to weld, or passed along parts from his own stockpile. He'd never told anyone. Keanu sat in silence, taking it in. He had always admired Frank's steadiness, the way he moved through the world with quiet purpose. But this hidden trail of kindness was something else. "You ever think about writing any of this down?" Keanu asked. Frank shook his head. "I didn't think anyone would care." "I care," Keanu said. Marty chimed in. "They'd all care, Frank. Maybe not the kind that gets headlines, but the kind that keeps the world turning." Frank leaned back and looked up at the rafters. "I was just doing what needed to be done." "And that," Marty said, "is what separates the real ones from the loud ones." One of the younger mechanics poked his head in. "Hey, Marty, you want to take a look at that Civic?" Marty waved him off. "In a bit." As they got up to leave, Marty walked them back to the truck and clapped Keanu on the back. "You got yourself a good one. Don't forget it." Keanu smiled. "I never will again." Frank slid into the passenger seat, and as Keanu started the engine, Marty called out one last time, "Frank." Frank turned. "You didn't just fix cars, you fixed people." Frank held up a hand in quiet thanks, then closed the door. The truck rumbled to life. As they pulled away, Keanu glanced over at Frank, who was staring out the window, silent, thoughtful. "You okay?" Frank gave a slight nod. "Just thinking, maybe it's all right to be remembered after all." Keanu smiled as they rolled on toward the next red circle on the map, carrying more than tools now. They were carrying legacy. They were back on the road before the sun crested the horizon, the world still caught in that soft hush that comes just before morning fully breaks. The air was cooler now, smoother, the sky ahead gradually bleeding orange into blue. With Montana and the mountains behind them, the flat stretches of desert road seemed endless, like a canvas waiting to be drawn on. Keanu drove in silence, the window cracked to let the breeze cut through the quiet, the hum of tires beneath them steady as a heartbeat. Frank sat reclined in the passenger seat, his hands folded over his chest, his breathing calm. He wasn't asleep, just resting, with eyes half shut and thoughts elsewhere. There was a different rhythm to him now, fewer words, longer pauses. Keanu noticed it, not with panic, but with a quiet awareness that something was shifting. Frank was slowing down, not in spirit, but in body. The road had taken some energy, and it was beginning to show. They didn't speak much that morning, letting the world outside do most of the talking. Joshua trees dotted the landscape as they edged closer to California. The distant shimmer of the coast was still far away, but the air had changed, warmer, saltier. At the state line, the classic "Welcome to California" sign stood crooked on the side of the road, covered in stickers and graffiti. Keanu glanced at it, then at Frank. "You missed the sign," Keanu teased. Frank opened one eye. "I've been welcomed by worse places." Keanu grinned. Frank sat up slowly and looked down at the wristwatch, the one Keanu had given him back at the overlook in Montana. His fingers traced the smooth steel band, then turned it to reread the engraving on the back. "We made it. This one," he said quietly, "I won't take off." Keanu nodded. "Good. I was afraid you might tuck it away like the last one." Frank's expression softened. "This isn't about hope anymore. It's about arrival." They rode another 20 minutes in silence before Frank said, "You know, you never owed me this trip." Keanu kept his eyes on the road. "That's where you're wrong." Frank didn't argue, he just rested a hand gently on Keanu's shoulder. When they pulled into a scenic overlook perched above the Pacific coast, Frank stepped out slowly, stretching his legs, and walked with Keanu to the railing. The ocean was endless. Keanu said nothing. He just stood beside him. Some views don't need words, and some debts are paid in presents, not promises. They left the overlook after an hour, driving along the winding edge of the Pacific Highway with the windows down and music low. It was an old mix CD Frank had made years ago. Soft folk, classic rock, and the occasional instrumental guitar piece. The kind of songs that didn't interrupt thought, just held space for it. Frank seemed lighter now. Maybe it was the view. Maybe it was the sound of waves trailing them as they moved south. But Keanu noticed something in the way Frank leaned his elbow out the window, in how his eyes wandered and rested longer on the horizon. He wasn't just sightseeing, he was remembering. "You know," Frank said at one point, "I never traveled farther than Texas when I was younger. Thought I'd see more after the war. But then, life." Keanu glanced over. "Regret it?" Frank shook his head. "Not a bit. I stuck around for the important stuff." Keanu smiled. "Like rusty starter motors and leaky hoses?" Frank chuckled. "And boys, who needed more than just someone to fix their bikes." The conversation lulled again. The road ahead curved and dipped, the ocean flashing in and out of view between cliffs. Birds floated above them in silence, and the world felt wide and endless. They stopped for lunch at a roadside diner with faded red booths and a jukebox that didn't work. The waitress greeted Frank like they'd known each other for years, even though they'd never met. "You've got one of those faces," she said, "like someone who should have been here all along." Frank only smiled. They shared a plate of fried fish and fries, splitting a milkshake afterward like they had decades ago. Keanu couldn't stop looking at Frank. Not in worry, just in awe. He was older, yes, but the strength was still there, tucked behind quiet eyes and a hand that never trembled when it rested on the table. Before they left, Keanu pulled a small envelope from his jacket and slid it across the booth. "What's this?" Frank asked. "Something I'd been meaning to give you for a long time." Inside was a short, handwritten letter. Nothing dramatic, just a few lines. "Thank you for the years, the tools, the silence, the steadiness. I'm me because of you." Frank read it twice. He didn't speak right away. Then he folded it slowly, placed it in his shirt pocket, and whispered, "That's going in the box." Keanu nodded. "I figured it would." Later that evening, they pulled into a quiet coastal motel. Nothing fancy, just a white cottage-style row of rooms with tiny patios and string lights glowing soft above each door. It was the kind of place where time felt slower, where you didn't need to say much to feel everything. Frank sat on a wooden bench outside their room, watching the sun slide into the ocean. Keanu came out with 2 mugs of tea, handing one over without a word. They clinked the mugs together gently. "To the road," Keanu said. "To the miles," Frank added. And they sipped. For a while, they just watched the horizon. The water shimmered with the last of the day's gold, and the waves whispered against the shore in a rhythm older than any of them. Keanu shifted in his chair. "You know, I think this is the first time we've sat still in days." Frank nodded. "Funny, isn't it? Spent all that time moving just to remember how much I like stopping." Keanu smiled. "You always liked the quiet." Frank chuckled. "Not just the quiet. The pause. That moment before you start the engine again." He looked down at his wrist, running his thumb over the new watch. The silver caught the last light of day. "This one," Frank said again. "I won't take off. Because it isn't about the time anymore. It's about the timing." Keanu tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Frank looked over, his voice steady but soft. "It didn't matter when we left. It mattered that you remembered." The words settled between them like a final puzzle piece falling into place. Keanu leaned back, letting the cool air hit his face. "I used to think I had all the time in the world," he admitted. "To say things, to fix things." "You learned," Frank said. "I did." The sky darkened slowly, stars beginning to pierce through the velvet dusk. Frank let out a long breath and looked out one last time toward the water. "I'm tired," he said quietly, "but not empty." Keanu stood and opened the door for him. Frank rose slowly, steadying himself with one hand on Keanu's shoulder. Inside, the room was dim and warm. As Frank sat on the edge of the bed, he looked around and said, "Feels like the last stop." Keanu shook his head gently. "Just a rest. We're still rolling." And when Frank smiled back, Keanu knew he believed it too. The next morning unfolded beneath a soft blanket of coastal fog. Everything felt still, like the world itself was holding its breath. Outside the small motel room, the breeze carried salt and silence. Keanu stepped onto the porch with 2 mugs of coffee and stood for a moment, watching the waves move slowly in the distance. There was no hurry, just rhythm, just time. Behind him, the door creaked open. Frank emerged slowly, dressed in a well-worn sweater and his walking shoes. He moved a little slower than yesterday, but with the same steady resolve. His eyes found the horizon. "Ready?" Keanu asked gently, offering him one of the mugs. Frank took it, nodded, and said, "If I'm going to meet the ocean, I'd rather not be late." Keanu smiled. They got into the truck and drove in silence. No radio, no chatter, just the hum of tires and the occasional sound of gulls overhead. The farther they drove, the quieter the world became. They passed the last of the coastal houses and wound down a narrow road that led to a hidden stretch of shoreline. When they arrived, there were no crowds, no parked cars, just the whisper of waves and a gravel lot that emptied into a winding footpath framed by tall beach grass. Keanu turned off the engine. "This is it," he said. Frank opened the door and stepped out. The cool morning air kissed his skin, and the sea breeze lifted the edge of his hat. With deliberate, careful steps, he followed the path. Keanu walked beside him, letting Frank lead. The path widened into a long, flat stretch of beach. Ahead of them, the ocean stretched endlessly, waves curling and breaking with ancient rhythm. Frank paused at the water's edge, the sand firm beneath his feet. He let out a breath, not heavy, just full. His eyes scanned the horizon. "Never thought I'd see this," he said softly. "Not like this." Keanu said nothing. He stood beside him, silent and still, letting the sound of the waves fill the space between them. Frank looked down at the wet sand, then out at the water again. "It's not about the miles, is it?" he whispered. Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "You brought me here more than I brought you." Frank didn't answer. He just nodded, eyes glassy, the Pacific stretching out in front of him like a story he'd finally reached the end of. They found a large piece of driftwood farther up the beach, sun-bleached, smooth, and shaped like a perfect bench. Frank eased himself down with Keanu's help and rested his hands on his knees, staring out at the surf. Keanu sat beside him, their shoulders almost touching, but not quite. The wind tugged gently at their jackets. Behind them, the dunes stood quiet. Ahead of them, the sea seemed endless. Frank leaned forward slightly. "You know, I used to dream about this. Not just the view, the stillness." Keanu nodded. "It's rare, even rarer to earn it." Frank smiled faintly. "Funny thing about getting old. The places you thought you'd see, some of them, don't matter anymore. But the people you wished would sit beside you when you got there, they matter more than ever." Keanu swallowed against the tightness rising in his throat. "I wish I'd gotten you here sooner." Frank shook his head slowly. "You got me here at the exact right time. I wasn't ready before." They sat in silence again. A flock of birds dipped low over the water, skimming the surface like paintbrushes on canvas. After a while, Frank pulled something from his coat pocket. A tiny shell, pale, cracked, almost translucent. "This," he said, placing it in Keanu's palm, was from the first beach I ever saw, Okinawa, 1971. I kept it through the war, through everything. Thought maybe I'd drop it somewhere better one day. Keanu looked down at the shell, then at Frank. Here? He asked. Frank nodded. This is better. Keanu stood and walked toward the tide line. He crouched low, dug a small hole just beyond where the waves could reach, and placed the shell inside. Then he covered it with sand, packed it gently, and stepped back. When he returned, Frank was watching him with a soft expression. You've always known how to finish things, Frank said. Keanu sat down again beside him. Not always, but I'm learning. They sat like that until the sun began to rise higher, the fog thinning, the colors deepening into a bright blue sky. The tide moved in, pulling the waves closer, whispering secrets older than words. Frank leaned his head back, eyes closed, soaking it all in. I'll remember this, he said, longer than I remember most things. Keanu turned to him, voice low. So will I. After a long while, Frank slowly rose to his feet, brushing the sand from his palms. He looked out one final time, letting his eyes take in the vastness of the sea. Keanu rose beside him, steadying him with a gentle hand under his elbow. I always imagined it, Frank said, voice low. But it's different when you're standing in front of it. Like the ocean isn't just water. It's all the time you thought you lost, coming back to say, it's okay. Keanu swallowed hard. Do you regret waiting so long? Frank shook his head. No, because if we had come earlier, maybe it wouldn't have felt like this. Maybe I wouldn't have appreciated it. Or you. Keanu placed a hand on Frank's back, a steady warmth. I used to think I needed to chase everything fast. Fame, films, success. But the best thing I ever caught was time with you. Frank glanced over. That sounds like something your mama would have said. Keanu smiled. She probably did. They began walking back toward the truck, their footprints trailing behind them in the soft sand. Frank moved slower now, but with a peace in his stride that hadn't been there before. As they reached the gravel lot, Keanu paused and looked back once more at the water. Frank followed his gaze. Feels like we just closed a chapter, Keanu said. No, Frank replied. We finally read the one we skipped. Keanu opened the truck door for Frank, and as he climbed in, he gave the dashboard a pat. Think this thing has one more leg in her? Keanu grinned. If she doesn't, we'll push her. They pulled back onto the coastal road, the ocean beside them, glittering now in full morning light. The silence in the cab wasn't heavy, it was full. A silence that came not from distance, but from deep understanding. Frank looked down at his wrist again, the watch gleaming faintly in the sun. It fits, he said simply. Keanu smiled. It was always yours. They drove on, the road winding along the cliffs, the breeze carrying the scent of salt and eucalyptus. Ahead, the next town waited, maybe another diner, another story. But nothing would top this day, because they had made it, together. No cameras, no scripts, just a road, a promise kept, and a view worth the wait. And in the quiet, Keanu finally understood something. Some journeys aren't about where you go, they're about who still walks beside you when you finally get there. The sun had dipped just below the horizon when they returned to the motel. The world outside draped in soft purples and deepening gold. The air was cooler now, quieter. No children on the beach, no chatter in the parking lot. Just the low hum of the ocean breathing in the distance. Keanu turned off the truck. Neither of them moved at first. It wasn't fatigue that kept them still, it was something else, like the end of something meaningful that neither of them wanted to interrupt too quickly. Frank reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a small envelope, the edges slightly worn, the paper soft from time. He held it out, not looking directly at Keanu. For later, he said, on your own. Keanu took it with both hands. His name was written across the front in blocky, deliberate letters. It was Frank's handwriting, just a little shakier than Keanu remembered from childhood notes, but unmistakably his. Frank gave him a faint smile. It's not much, just what I didn't know how to say out loud. Keanu nodded. Okay. They said nothing else. Just walked into the room, settled into the routine of quiet brushing teeth, folded clothes, lights dimmed. Later that night, when Frank was asleep, Keanu stepped outside. The porch creaked beneath his feet. He sat in one of the old chairs overlooking the beach. In the distance, the waves folded into each other like slow, sleepy breaths. He turned the envelope over once, then opened it. Inside was a sheet of lined paper folded twice. It had been written with a ballpoint pen. Blue ink, slightly smudged in places where Frank's hand had probably rested too long on the page. The first line made Keanu still. You were never a promise broken, just a story still being written. He read the line again, and again. I know you think you let time slip, that maybe I sat around waiting for years. But the truth is, son, I wasn't counting the missed calls. I was watching the long arc of your life, and I never once felt forgotten. Keanu swallowed hard, the words sinking deeper with each sentence. I saw it all, the way you carried people, how you showed up when it mattered. You didn't owe me this trip, but you gave it to me anyway. That's more than most sons ever do. The next line was underlined in steady, dark strokes. I was proud the whole way through. Keanu let the words settle like dust, soft but impossible to ignore. He could feel them in his chest, not as guilt, but as weight. A grounding. He leaned forward in the chair, elbows on his knees, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. Then he continued reading. You didn't see me, but I saw you. In every interview, every film, every quiet act you thought no one noticed. I saw the boy who used to listen more than he spoke, who asked too many questions about things no one else thought to explain. I saw that same boy in every good thing you did. A gust of wind stirred the edges of the page, but Keanu held it tighter. I kept that first watch not because of what it cost. I kept it because of what it meant, and when I gave it up, it wasn't because I'd given up on you. It was because I knew I didn't need the promise anymore. I already had the best part of it, you. Keanu stared at that line for a long moment. The fog began rolling back in, brushing across the sand like a slow curtain. I never told you this, the letter went on, but the day you left for Los Angeles, I stood in the garage long after the car was gone. I cleaned your old toolbox. I found a bent screwdriver you always said was lucky. I kept it, still have it, because even if you weren't under the same roof, you were always under my care. Keanu blinked hard, clearing the wetness gathering in his eyes. And now, after all this time, after the miles and years and silence, you brought me to the ocean. You remembered. You showed up, and you listened, just like you always did, even when you thought you hadn't done enough. Keanu let out a shaky breath, the kind that didn't quite become a sigh. The last few lines were smaller, more deliberate, like Frank had slowed down, choosing each word as if it were the last one he'd write. Keep the watch, not as a symbol of guilt, but as a reminder. Some dreams just take longer to arrive. That doesn't make them less true. And son, the final line sat on its own, centered on the bottom of the page. Thank you for the ride. Keanu folded the letter slowly, pressing the creases with care, like it was something fragile and sacred. He didn't rush. His fingers moved like they were handling something more than paper, like they were folding time, memory, and love back into something he could carry. He stared out into the night. The waves continued their rhythm. The tide had crept closer to the motel, reaching the line where sand met pavement. Moonlight shimmered across the surface like silver veins. Keanu leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about the long years he'd spent running, toward something, away from other things. He'd built a career, lost people he loved, grown into a man who still carried the child who once sat on a milk crate in Frank's garage, watching hands shape metal and lives. All this time, he'd worried about what he hadn't done. The birthdays missed, the promises delayed. But in Frank's words, there was no blame, No lingering sorrow, just grace. He opened his eyes and looked at the stars again. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt light. The letter now sat folded in his lap, warm from his hands. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the same watch he'd found at the thrift store. Frank's old one, the one he had given him as a teenager. He turned it over in his palm and ran a thumb across the engraving. Or, the road trip we'll take someday. He smiled. Then he reached into his duffel and pulled out a small tin box he hadn't opened in years. Inside was a patch from Frank's old mechanic jacket, a few Polaroids of the garage, and now, he gently placed the watch and the letter inside. Not to forget, but to preserve. He stood and quietly stepped back into the motel room. Frank was fast asleep, one arm resting gently over his stomach, the rhythm of his breathing, slow and even. Keanu placed the tin box on the nightstand, just where Frank would see it in the morning. Then he sat beside the bed in the nearby chair, watching him for a moment. Not as a son with something to prove, but as a man with nothing left to regret. Some things take time. Some promises are quiet, but when they're kept, they echo louder than words. Keanu whispered softly, "Thank you for waiting." The plane touched down in Toronto under a slate-gray sky, the clouds hanging low and motionless like they were waiting for something. Autumn had arrived in full, leaves scattered in wet clusters, the air cool and sharp. Keanu stepped off the flight with a small carry-on and one wooden box tucked securely under his arm. No entourage, no press, just him and the quiet weight of something unfinished that now needed a place to rest. The pickup truck had made it as far back as Oregon before they'd arranged to have it shipped home. Frank had insisted on driving the final mile to the airport himself. "You drove west," he'd said. "Let me bring us home." Keanu smiled at the memory. Now, standing in the stillness of his study, Keanu surveyed the room where he kept his most personal reminders. There were no movie posters, no awards, just framed letters from his sister, a faded photo of his mother smiling beside a garden, and a small shelf with hand-carved figures from around the world. Today, he cleared a space on the central wall. He opened the wooden box gently and began laying out its contents. The old watch, a little more worn now, but still ticking faintly. The folded road map, marked in red ink, creased from years of being opened, closed, dreamed over. The diner receipt from Arizona with Frank's shaky but familiar handwriting on the back. Tasted the same. A black and white photo taken at the Montana viewpoint, Frank sitting on the hood of the truck, his eyes half closed, smiling into the wind, mountains rising like a memory behind him. And, folded carefully, the letter Frank had given him at the motel, the one Keanu would never forget. Each item was placed inside a shadow box, not as a display but as a story told without a single spoken word. He didn't straighten the photo too much or try to press the map flat. He wanted it to feel like it had just been touched, like Frank had just stepped away. Finally, Keanu fixed a small brass plaque at the bottom of the frame. He traced the inscription with his fingers before reading it out loud. For the man who never left the driveway, but always showed the way. Keanu stood back and looked at the finished piece. It didn't shine, it didn't draw attention, but it held everything that mattered. A few days later, Patricia came by for tea. She moved more slowly now, leaning on a polished cane that had belonged to her father, but her mind was as sharp as ever. When Keanu opened the door, she gave him a long, knowing look. "You've got something to show me," she said before he even spoke. He nodded. "Yeah, I do." He led her into the study. She stepped in and saw it instantly, her hand flying to her mouth as she took in the shadow box on the wall. For a while, she said nothing. Her eyes scanned every detail. The receipt, the map, the folded letter she didn't ask to read but somehow understood. And that watch. How many times had she seen it on Frank's wrist as he walked out the door or sat at the table, fixing something with a fork and a screwdriver? Finally, she stepped closer. Her hand reached out, but stopped just short of the glass. "This is him," she whispered. "This is exactly him." Keanu stood silently beside her. The room felt fuller now, like Frank had walked in and sat down beside them, his quiet presence stretching across the air like a warm coat. "I didn't get it right for a long time," Keanu said softly, "but I wanted to." Patricia turned to him. "You got it right where it counted. He never needed perfect, just true." They sat down for tea at the corner table, 2 mugs steaming between them. Patricia smiled as she looked again at the box. "Do you remember the day your car wouldn't start?" she asked suddenly. Keanu nodded. "We were stranded off Finch Avenue. I was maybe 10. Hell came out of nowhere," she said, smiling faintly. "Didn't even ask for a thank you. Just knelt beside the car, fixed it, and walked away like it was nothing. But he stayed. He never really left." "No," Keanu said. "He never did." The clock in the hallway ticked on, and in the soft silence that followed, the memory of a man who fixed more than engines stayed with them, framed not just on a wall, but in every heartbeat that remembered what love looked like when it asked for nothing in return. Later that evening, long after Patricia had left and the house had fallen into its usual quiet, Keanu returned to the study alone. He turned on the small reading lamp near the wall, casting a soft glow on the shadow box. He stood in front of it, taking everything in again, not as a son mourning what was lost, but as a man finally understanding the full shape of what had been given. The map, folded just like Frank used to keep it. The diner receipt, faint coffee ring still on the corner. That watch, ticking softly, defiantly, like it was still keeping time for something important. And the letter? The last of Frank's voice, sealed in words that had filled spaces Keanu hadn't known were still empty. There was nothing fancy about it, no golden frames or spotlights. But that was the point. Frank never wanted credit, he wanted presence, and now his story had a place. Not just in Keanu's home, but in the rhythm of his days, in the decisions, the silences, the moments of pause that reminded him who had shown him the way. He sat down across the room with a notebook in his lap, the one Frank had given him years ago, back when he first said he wanted to be an actor. Keanu opened it and scribbled a note in the corner of a blank page. "Frank Donovan, the man who never told me what to be, but reminded me who I was." Then he closed it, placed it back on the shelf, and stood once more in front of the box. Tomorrow would come with its usual demands, scripts, schedules, people calling his name. But tonight, there was just this. The hum of the city beyond the window, the soft sound of the hallway clock, and the quiet ticking of a watch that had crossed a continent not for attention, but for closure. He turned off the lamp, but not before whispering one last thing into the room. "I made it home, Frank." Then he walked out, leaving the light of memory to glow on that wall a few moments longer. Like a lighthouse left burning, not because someone is lost, but because someone finally found their way. The weather was different this time, no longer the chill of autumn. Spring had softened the roadways, lining them with bursts of yellow wildflowers and streaks of green pushing up through the thawed ground. Keanu drove alone, the same truck humming beneath him, its vintage engine grumbling gently as if it too remembered the way. Months had passed since the end of their trip, since Frank's chair by the garage sat empty, since the light in his room dimmed for the last time. But grief didn't arrive like thunder anymore. It came softly, in quiet echoes. Keanu hadn't taken this road again out of sorrow. He took it for something else, something that needed finishing, a promise that didn't end with a beach or a plaque on a wall. He didn't tell anyone he was going. No press, no announcement, just a tank of gas, a camera, and a bottle tucked in the glove box. Inside it, the old watch rested, gently wrapped in a soft cloth. It still ticked, just faintly, its face scratched from time, but its meaning unscathed. The first stop was the Arizona diner. He arrived just after sunrise, the windows glowing orange. The parking lot was mostly empty, and the same bell jingled overhead when he stepped inside. A different waitress greeted him, younger than the one Frank had remembered. But the booths were the same, The counter was still lined with ceramic coffee mugs. The scent of frying bacon lingered in the air. Keanu ordered black coffee and sat at the exact table they once had, 2 mugs, a single note between them. He stayed a while, not speaking, just remembering. Then, carefully, he reached into his jacket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and slid it under the edge of the sugar jar. 3 words written in firm, steady script. He made it. He paid and stepped outside into the rising light, taking one photo of the booth from the window. The empty seat, the slanted sunlight, the dust motes hanging in the air like time refusing to settle. Then he drove north. At the Montana overlook, wind rushed across the cliff as Keanu parked the truck in the same gravel patch. He stepped out, jacket flapping behind him. The view was still breathtaking, but this time there were no words, just silence and a quiet camera click as he captured the empty truck against the mountains. A quiet tribute, 1 leg left to go. Keanu continued west. The roads twisted and widened as he entered Oregon, then narrowed again in small coastal towns. He followed the route they had taken before, only this time, each stop was accompanied by a photograph, each frame holding a moment without people, but filled with presence. He pulled over at a gas station that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. The paint was peeling from the siding. The same neon open sign blinked in the window. He remembered Frank laughing here, arguing with the pump attendant over the price of windshield washer fluid. Keanu smiled at the memory and took a picture of the station, empty now but alive in his mind. As he passed through the quiet towns and fading highway signs, Keanu realized something. He wasn't retracing Frank's trip. He was honoring his patience. Frank had waited years for a journey that wasn't about destination, but about companionship, about a promise held quietly in the background, never forced, never forgotten. Keanu stopped at a roadside park next, one with worn benches and an old wooden swing. The swing still creaked as the wind pushed it gently. He sat there a while, watching trees sway. Then he stood and took a picture of the swing as it drifted back into stillness. Each click of the camera felt like a word spoken, like he was telling Frank, "I see it now, all of it." Late the next day, Keanu arrived in California. The ocean stretched out before him like an open canvas, wild and endless. The same beach, the same tide. But this time he stood there alone, holding the bottle in his hand. He walked down the sand, past the place where he and Frank had once sat. He removed his shoes and let the cold water hit his feet. Then, gently, he knelt in the surf. He pulled the bottle from his jacket, unscrewed the lid once to make sure everything was still inside, the watch, the cloth, and one last folded message. "We finished it." He resealed it, then stood again. He looked out across the horizon, past the waves, and whispered the final words only the ocean needed to hear. "Goodbye, Frank." Then he drew back and threw the bottle far into the tide. It bobbed, shimmered, and was taken, not quickly, but with dignity, like it knew where it was going, like Frank always had. Keanu remained at the shoreline long after the bottle vanished from sight. The waves rolled in, curled at his ankles, then pulled back again, each one softer than the last. The sky above had turned a muted gold, and the breeze carried the scent of salt and something older, something sacred. He closed his eyes. All around him were the echoes of places Frank had once only dreamed about. Landscapes he'd traced in red ink on old maps, stops circled with hope and scribbled notes in the margins. And now they weren't just dreams. They were memories, lived, shared, completed. Back at the truck, Keanu opened the glove box and pulled out his camera. He snapped one final photo, the ocean from where he stood, the horizon wide and glowing. This time, he set the camera down and just breathed. No audience, no script, just the wind and the truth of a journey that had ended exactly where it was meant to. Before leaving, He crouched near a weathered driftwood log and began stacking small stones, one on top of the other, 5 in total. It wasn't a monument. It wasn't meant to be seen, but he knew Frank would have liked it. Simple, grounded, quiet. He returned to the truck and took the long route back up the coast, not rushing, not even thinking about tomorrow. Every mile now held something more, not an echo, but a presence. He stopped once to fill the tank and glanced into the rearview mirror. Not out of habit, but because for a second he could almost see Frank sitting there beside him, arm out the window, eyes scanning the world like it was still brand new. And, in a way, it was. By the time Keanu reached the edge of the city, the sun had dipped low again, casting long shadows across the road ahead. He pulled into his driveway, parked the truck, and just sat for a while with his hands on the wheel. There had been a beginning. There had been a promise. And now there was the road that carried it through. He looked out toward the sky one last time and whispered, "That was for you." Then he turned off the ignition and stepped into the quiet night. One man, lighter, fuller, and finally home. The truck sat parked in the quiet of early morning. Dew clung to the windshield. Birds stirred in the trees above. The world hadn't quite woken yet, but inside the cab, Keanu sat still, wrapped in a silence he welcomed. His hands rested on the steering wheel, fingers tracing the worn leather as if remembering how many miles had passed beneath it. In his lap was the new watch, sleek, silver, engraved on the back with the words, "Frank had spoken," the day they reached California. "This one I won't take off." Keanu turned the watch over gently. It ticked softly, almost lost beneath the breath of wind rolling through the window crack. But he heard it. Every beat, every second, each one echoing the rhythm of the road they had traveled and the life they had built between them, without needing a title or a bloodline. The passenger seat still held a folded map, same red ink, same hopeful circles, but now every place had a check mark, not just on the paper, but in the story. Keanu exhaled slowly and looked out at the street ahead. It was just his neighborhood in Toronto. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic. But in that moment, it felt like the road was still stretching forward, not behind. He glanced back at the glove compartment, remembering the bottle and the way it floated out to sea. He hadn't told anyone, not because it needed to be secret, but because it had been sacred. Frank's legacy didn't ask for headlines. It asked for follow-through, for showing up, for keeping a promise, even if it took decades. Keanu reached over and turned the key once, not to start the engine, but just to feel the hum, to remind himself the journey was still alive, still possible, that even when people were gone, the roads they paved beneath us didn't disappear. He sat back again, the morning light beginning to grow softer, golden now against the dashboard. He looked down at the watch in his palm. Then he spoke, not loud, but clear enough to rise above the quiet ticking. "Some promises take years," he said, "but the ones that matter, they wait for you." He looked straight ahead, then slowly turned toward the camera, the watch still resting gently in his hand. "If this story moved you," he said softly, "like, share, and subscribe." He paused, not for effect, but to let the next words settle into the space between them. "And maybe it's time to keep a promise you once made." He didn't blink. He didn't smile. He just let the quiet speak for itself. Because not all calls to action need to be loud. Some need to be truthful. Some need to be remembered. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small photo, one from the diner. The empty booth, the coffee mug, the paper napkin. He slid it into the sun visor above his seat and let it stay there, not to be admired, just to be carried. Then he glanced down at the watch one final time and slipped it onto his wrist. It didn't fit perfectly. It didn't need to. He closed the glove compartment, rolled the window down, and leaned back in the driver's seat. The city was waking up now, but for a few more seconds he allowed himself to stay in that in-between place where memories don't hurt and love doesn't leave. In the background, birds chirped. A car started a few houses down, and somewhere, far away, maybe a tide still held a floating bottle, its message wrapped in time, still searching for a shore. Keanu reached forward and turned off the ignition. Silence filled the cabin. Then, just before the screen faded, the camera held on his wrist. On the new watch. The second hand ticked once, then again, and then the frame gently faded to black. In the closing image, resting side by side on the dash, were two simple objects, a wrench and a pencil. The tools of the man who fixed more than engines, and the boy he once taught to build things that mattered. The story didn't need more words. It had already said everything it came to say. But its final heartbeat came in the sound of that ticking watch, quiet and steady, just like Frank Donovan, just like the road. Still going.